Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy, part one of our EV mini-series. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is my co-host, Niall Riedel. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's great to be back.
It is fantastic to have you back. For our audience members, you may recognize Neil from an episode we did on the main show. Neil has come back on as a co-host for this mini-series. So let's start by talking about what it is you and I are trying to achieve, or what are we doing with an EV mini-series?
Well, we're in this crazy juncture where we're transitioning fuel types away from petrol and diesel and into the world of electricity in our mobility ecosystem. So really what we wanted to do was dive a bit deeper into what this means, what's going on, bring some insights from some of the experts in this world so that others can follow the transition as it happens.
Yeah, I agree with that. My intent was to find information you just can't get easily anywhere else. So what I see is a holistic approach. If you look at our audience coming in, many come from the energy industry. So there's a component of electrifying everything that's probably relevant to this conversation. And it impacts the producers of energy, the traders of energy. Everybody's impacted. But it's more than this to me, right? It's not just, do I go buy a new Tesla, or is the coolest electric car going to be fast? There's a whole ecosystem and things to support this electric vehicle transition. And I hope we cover a lot of that during this series.
Yeah, we're going to have to dive deep into the world of how do you recharge these vehicles? Where does energy come from? Is it going to impact the grid? How much more energy do we need? Should we change the type of energy? What does it mean for manufacturing and supply chains? What are the automotive industry having to do to adapt to this? What do the oil and gas guys think of this? There's a fascinating spectrum of players in this ecosystem, and it'd be really insightful to dig into individual areas and understand what's going on beneath the surface.
So to give you an idea of the scope, I think we've already scheduled out 18 episodes with room to grow as we find and explore things. So this isn't going to be a one and done, although some of your audience may want to listen to what interests you, but you're going to get a really in-depth. At the end of this, I expect that you really know EVs and what they're like in today's environment. But I guess it makes sense to kind of start at the beginning, as they say. So where are we going to go today?
Well, I'm delighted to say that we've had a short conversation with a gentleman from PwC by the name of Adrian Del Maestro. I've known Adrian for a while now, and his job title says it all. He's the head of thought leadership. Now, the question you've always got to ask someone like that is, how did it all begin? And what does thought leadership look like during this energy transition, during this mobility transition? And what insights does he have to tell his clients about what we're going through, the changes that we see, and how he's maybe guiding them through this complex landscape? So hopefully today, Adrian's going to be able to answer some interesting questions on the challenges that he sees and the activity that he's having to guide his customers on.
I see him smiling in the video. If you're not just listening and watching this, you'll see that he finds this amusing. So I think without any further ado, Neil, why don't you bring our guest on the show and see how he answers these questions?
So, hey, Adrian, welcome to the show. I'd love to ask you that first killer question, which is, your role at PwC as head of thought leadership. How did you get there, and what is it that you do?
Well, hi, guys. And firstly, thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak, and lovely to be with you. How did I get there is an interesting question, in as much as it wasn't a prescribed route. So I started off my education. I did French and Spanish at university. Then I did international history as a master's. I went into correspondent banking, which was all about doing credit reports, and I liked analyzing things. And then I got a lucky break. I landed up working for two guys, one of whom was our former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond. And they ran a consulting company for the energy sector. And I was the guy who did all the research, advising our energy clients, and then ran the company. And from that, went on to Ernst & Young, back then, EY now, managing their research function for energy, then Booz Allen Hamilton, and now PwC. So a long, fortuitous route, but I got there in the end.
And that means that you're clearly doing huge amounts of research day to day, and the focus clearly is around the decarbonisation agenda. What are your immediate thoughts? What can you tell our listeners about where that's going and who you're speaking to and why you're advising them to do certain things?
So I think the big message, and many of your listeners will already know this. I mean, when I started looking at the energy sector, you were lucky to get a couple of references in the middle of the newspaper. For those of us who still read hard copy back in the day, now energy is all headline news, and it's fundamental to the way we operate. And clearly, with the whole focus on decarbonisation, it's impacting multitudes of sectors. So companies are having to figure out how they can decarbonize so that we leave a better future for our children and all the people that will be following us. And that's quite a shift that's going on in the sector. And on top of that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it in a bit more detail, I mean, in the old world of oil and gas, you had geopolitics. Those geopolitics are ramping up right now, and you can see the whole, all the ramifications of the Ukraine conflict, how that's clashing with decarbonization, how that's accelerating decarbonization, how it's complicating the way companies have to operate to navigate all this change. And the last thing I'd say, and I quite often when I speak to clients, you know that popular phrase, a once in a lifetime event. And it used to be literally that. Now, I feel as though we have once in a lifetime events every couple of years. We had Brexit in the UK, we had COVID, now we've got the energy crisis. It just seems to be that if you're a corporate, you're having to build a resilient business around a world that's constantly reinventing itself and new waves of change.
And underlying all of this, you've already mentioned decarbonisation. I mean, the big picture in decarbonisation, clearly climate change, but what other sort of benefits can we expect to see as we transition away from old fuel types and into the new fuel types?
So it's sometimes helpful just to kind of narrow that lens down. So if you look at, I know we're going to talk a little bit about mobility, but if you look at EV charging, for example, there's clearly the decarbonisation that helps accelerate that trend. There is the air quality. There's the creation of a new industry. You think of all the new jobs that are required, all those new opportunities for old age companies, old age energy companies that are reinventing themselves, new business models, enormous amounts of opportunity and innovation that we're seeing as a result of this. So frankly, it's really exciting to be part of all of that.
And I guess one of the things that's really supported this transition is batteries. Electric mobility was a kind of a pipe dream 6 or 8 years ago. People were just starting to wake up as Tesla was launching its first vehicles. But, we've suddenly got these far superior battery technologies available to us. Can you talk a bit about how batteries has influenced, or the change in batteries has influenced this landscape?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you can take the battery conversation in a multitude of directions. I think that there's one area which is around the necessity for energy storage in a world where you're going to have more decentralized intermittent power. So if you think about the old world, you have a power station that was producing energy in one part of the country and pushing that energy to where all the consumers are in the other part of the country. Now you've got offshore wind turbines, you've got PV solar panels on rooftops. You've got this decentralized bidirectional flow of energy. And because it's intermittent by its very nature, you need battery storage, you need battery technology to manage the ebbs and flows of that technology. So there's a big opportunity and a big play on that. There's obviously linked to that, to the whole mobility revolution that we're seeing with electric vehicles and electric batteries. And on the one hand, there's a nice angle about how electric vehicles are being perceived in a very different way. So just take a step back for a second. In the good old days, when you thought about internal combustion engines, you'd talk about a car's acceleration, the vroom that it has, the luxury of the interior design. Nowadays, if you think about the Ford launched one of their new electric vehicles, one of the angles that promoted it was they were saying the battery's powerful enough to power your house for 3 days running. So it's kind of on the back of that Texas energy crisis. So the whole perception of what a car does, what the role of a battery is, it's not just to power that electric vehicle, it's to power your lifestyle. And it's that classic thing of vehicle to grid, that you have these mobile batteries that can also help balance the system.
So are the batteries at a stage today to get us there? Or are we still in early innings, as I would say as an American with my baseball analogy?
I'm not a big fan of baseball, but I get the gist. I think in terms of energy storage and balancing the system, we're making progress, but we've got some way to go. If you think about the type of batteries in the world right now, the two big ones are pumped storage and traditional battery technology like lithium ion. Most of the energy storage we have in the world is pumped storage. That's the bulk of it. But the growth will be battery storage, and I think that's still got a long way to go. terms of electric vehicle batteries, that's pretty much a success story. I'm sure we're going to talk about it in a bit more detail, but you're seeing a proliferation of electric vehicles that are coming onto the market. If you think about some of the numbers, on the one hand, it sounds quite impressive. So you've got something like 6 million vehicles, electric vehicles, in terms of sales in 2021. A large chunk of that from China. China alone sold more new cars than the world sold back in 2020. There's something like 16 million electric vehicles on the road today. It sounds a lot, but there are 1.4 billion cars in total. So these are impressive growth rates in terms of electric vehicles. They're still a fraction of the population, but the trajectory is impressive and growing. So electric batteries and electric vehicles, clearly lots of momentum there.
So you talked about traditional batteries, let's say lithium batteries and things like that. In your opening remarks, you mentioned geopolitics a bit. And if I look at the world geopolitics, it tends to be a lot about hydrocarbons and things like that tend to fuel a lot of the geopolitics. How does that change with rare earths and metals and things that I need for battery technology as opposed to getting petroleum?
Yeah, so lovely question. And when you think about the search for oil and gas around the world, geopolitics is a big part of that equation. And there is a school of thought out there that one of the reasons why we need to accelerate the energy transition, not just from a sustainability perspective, is it provides us some kind of protection from these geopolitical pressures. I think that's a bit naive, because if you think about what some of those critical elements that you've alluded to that are going to drive the energy transition, the demand for copper is going to be massive. That is not going to be isolated for geopolitics. You think of cobalt, which is a key ingredient in electric vehicle batteries. I think 60% of the cobalt in the world comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's one country that has a dominant source of cobalt. So I think geopolitics...
And a very stable political country at that, I've heard. So,
sorry?
And a very stable government in that country as well, I believe.
Exactly. And while we're on this topic, Chris, the way that cobalt is mined is not particularly ethical or sustainable as well, which it lends that other dimension that sometimes when people talk about electric vehicles being really good and sustainable, they are good and we need them. But that supply chain has complications and complexity as well.
And I guess that's crucial that we assess those supply chains and look for alternative ways to create battery storage so that we can move away from things that are hugely impactful and find much more sustainable resources. Have you heard or spoken to many people about the recycling of batteries and how we can manage that sort of end of life? This question always comes up when you're talking to people.
Yeah, and that's another great question. So I do think that's if the electric vehicle revolution is a nascent industry like hydrogen, like carbon capture, I think that recycling is even further back. So I think there's a huge potential there. And I think, the big lesson I've taken away, one of the big lessons I've taken away just speaking to clients about the energy transition is there isn't a silver bullet. There's no one technology that's going to help us decarbonize. You've got a portfolio of technologies that will play together and complement each other to help us decarbonize. And clearly, recycling of batteries, while that's still very much a nascent industry, that's going to play a bigger role going forward.
So we're seeing quite a change in the landscape of players, and one of the key customer groups that we're most interested in is the electricity industry itself, the providers of this future fuel source. Can you tell us a bit more about how these companies are adapting to the world of electric mobility and the fact that there's a competition now around where petrol and gas stations used to provide the fuel of the past for vehicles, and now it's going to be electric vehicle charging? How do you see that dynamic affecting these companies?
So that's a really simple but very complex question. So if we look at these in the broadest sense as energy companies, so whether you're a regenerator of electricity, whether you're an oil and gas producer, many of these companies are diversifying into low carbon. And they're diversifying into low carbon because there's clearly an important role from a sustainability angle, but there's a huge revenue opportunity for them in terms of building new capabilities, new value chains to deliver that low carbon world. And therefore, you've got lots of competition. and you've got lots of innovation. And I think that's really important, because if you think about how we're going to transform our world, you're going to need a lot of money. It's not going to be cheap. There's a big question about who pays for that. We're talking about trillions of dollars of investment year on year. But that innovation angle is going to be critical, because people are going to come up with new business models, new technologies that enable us to get there faster. And therefore, you're seeing all these energy companies collaborating with one another. It's really interesting how you're seeing that model, that partnership model, which, in the oil and gas industry, which I grew up in, partnerships are all about syndicating risk, syndicating financial risk, syndicating technical risk, bringing new capabilities to the table. Now you're seeing these energy companies form these partnerships precisely for that same reason, because you cannot deliver all the solutions across EV charging, helping decarbonize industrial clusters all on your own. You have to bring a portfolio of skill sets, and therefore you see these companies partnering with one another. But at the same time, they're all competing with one another, because they see this world, this future world that's electrifying, and kind of the golden goal is to own the customer. And therefore, how do you own that customer? The customer being the likes of you guys and myself, right? And you have to think about, where do you play in these different value chains? What bit of the vertical do you want to own? How do you bring these capabilities together? How do you sell and cross-sell more to those end consumers in a world where, and forgive me for going on about this, but and Neil, you know about this, the journey of that traditional electric vehicle owner. They buy the electric vehicle. They suddenly think, oh, wow, I better get a charger. So they need to get a charger at home. They then realize that their consumption of electricity at home goes through the roof. Wow, better get a special EV charging tariff. They then speak to their friends who are also in electric vehicles, and they've got rooftop solar PV. You suddenly go on this journey of services, software, hardware, and that's what these energy companies are trying to play into.
But are they going to change, right? So if you look at the old model, the assets that they built, you maybe got 30 years out of an asset, or you had a huge invest in assets, and now you've got distributed models. You've got small players coming in. I get some investors together. I open a wind farm or a solar park, and now I'm in the energy game, and partner with some software vendors to help me make virtual power plant or whatever I want to become. How do the legacy players play into the future, or do they? Do they cannibalize themselves? Are they starting that yet to be the next generation, or are they going to be dinosaurs that become buggy whip makers in the future?
Yeah, it's not a black and white decision, that one. I think if we take a step back and you look at global energy demand now, on a macro level, about 80% is provided by hydrocarbons, oil, coal, and gas. If you look at some of those IEA scenarios going forward to 2050, that share of hydrocarbons shrinks dramatically, but it's still a sizable share. So the reality is, to some extent, we're still going to need hydrocarbons. So you're going to have some players who are hydrocarbon players, and they're going to stay hydrocarbon players. But what they will need to do in order to survive is to produce those hydrocarbons efficiently from a financial perspective, but more importantly, with as low emission footprint as possible, and invest in the technology to deliver it. And that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got those companies that are reinventing themselves or diversifying into low carbon. And you've got some oil and gas majors that are a good example, excuse me, where they're using their oil and gas business as the cash flow engine, and shifting that capex from their legacy business more and more into the low carbon business, which grows over time. And then you've got pure play low carbon players. I probably have to be careful about mentioning brand names, but there's a very famous offshore wind operator that is now the leading player in its sector. It started off as an oil and gas company with an upstream business. And it took them about 10 years when they made the strategic decision to focus on low carbon. So you're going to see many of these companies transform themselves, and probably in a much shorter time period, because of the pressing need to decarbonize.
Okay, so we talked about the industry change. let's go into the EV angle. We're early there as well. You gave the percentages. There's a very small percentage of vehicles that are EVs right now. Um, and you talked a little bit about the advertising. I think you talked about the Ford release, and people were looking at how long this thing charges their house. So, assuming we want transportation, are we talking just like big batteries? Or are we talking transportation? Do I still have to worry about my car? Or is the model changing of what we want out of that thing sitting in my driveway?
So again, let's just take a step back, and I think I alluded to this right at the beginning. When we're talking about decarbonisation of industry, the big wave has been in the power generation sector. So if you look at our little country, the United Kingdom, we've seen a massive change in our power generation, where we get about 30% of our generation capacity from renewables, 40% from gas, and coal is being phased out. And I think if you look at many countries, you see that decarbonisation of power generation. That's a success story. The next wave now is transportation, and particularly road. And if we just look at it through a very big lens of fleets, so when you think of corporates that have lots of cars, so you may be a professional services firm that offer transport to their employees, lots of cars. You may be a logistics provider and you have lots of cars and vans. These companies are looking at decarbonising their fleets, and they're seeing the opportunity there. And they're starting on that journey. And at a very high level, you've got a story in three parts. You've got the light vehicles that are being electrified, and that's pretty much the consensus is that's the way it's going to go, and the momentum's there. That middle section of vehicles that are heavier, think of like 1.5, 3 ton vans, for example. There's a mixed story about how those are going to be decarbonized. So you've got some of them that are being electrified, but they haven't got a great range, and you have to trade off load, payload, and range. Some of them are using biogas, alternative fuels. And then you've got those heavy goods vehicles, which right now it's not clear what that solution will be. There's some electrification going on, but it's difficult. There's a big expectation about hydrogen, but the refueling infrastructure isn't in place yet. So big question mark. So you're seeing these macro trends. And as the likes of you and I, if you live in a city, you may be thinking about buying an electric vehicle, but you've got a few big question marks in your mind. One is, am I comfortable paying the premium of buying an electric vehicle compared to its ICE, internal combustion engine counterpart? And how the hell am I going to charge that vehicle if I live in a flat in a densely populated city? So you got a momentum to adopt electric vehicles, but there's some practical challenges that people have to deal with.
And Adrian, one of the things I'm super conscious of is I spend 90% of my waking hours thinking about electric vehicles. But the reality is there are these alternative fuels out there. Could you say a few words on hydrogen and how you think we might be able to move hydrogen forward, not just for transport, but for more broadly decarbonising our economy? Because there's a lot said, but it's a really hard thing to deliver on.
Yeah, and hydrogen, we could spend a couple of hours talking about hydrogen. It's just a kind of a broad comment on hydrogen, and then a comment on hydrogen and road transportation. The broad comment about hydrogen is I frankly think there's a lot of hype about hydrogen. There's that wonderful expression, hydrogen is the Swiss Army knife of the energy world. It has all these multiple end user perspectives and purposes. And the reality is, I think that hydrogen has a role to play. When I talked about that portfolio of energy solutions for the transition, it's got a role to play, but it's a very specific role. So I think there's a big opportunity for hydrogen where it's already being used as a feedstock. Think of refining, for example, refineries. I think there's a big opportunity for hydrogen in hard to abate sectors like industrial clusters. Yeah. And I think there may be an opportunity for some of those heavy goods vehicles as a fuel there. On that fuel around hydrogen for road transport, if I just hark back to a report that we did, Fleets Ahead, about a year ago, we interviewed a whole bunch of fleet managers. And they were pretty consistent in the messaging, which was, we haven't got a clear-cut solution for heavy goods vehicles. We think hydrogen's the solution, The problem is we don't have much of a refueling infrastructure in place. So in the UK, for example, I think there's something like 11 or 12 outlets that you can fill up with hydrogen. You need to build an infrastructure before people start buying the hydrogen trucks. It's that classic chicken and egg.
But isn't that happening in the U.S.? $9 billion worth of tax credits over the next 10 years are in place to jumpstart that from an economy. So the countries that want to reduce the hydrogen hurdle right now is cost, right? It's not the technology. The fuel density is different, but there's uses where it's good. Where I've heard people say it's particularly powerful is where you're just going to switch the molecule, perhaps, and it's not necessarily hydrogen, but rather than changing every jet in the world, we're going to have more of a net zero approach type of, we're not adding any new carbon, but we're not necessarily taking it away type of a thing. And it's an easy drop in for a few industries. And you mentioned steel and these other production things where it's already there. And it's just a question of making green hydrogen, which to my understanding has been a function of cost. The reason we don't see the infrastructure is that it's still cheaper to use alternatives right now. And so there needs to be some sort of policy or an investment to make it a viable thing. And so it's interesting to see how it works in the US, because the US has definitively made a statement to go there. And I'm seeing projects and I'm talking to people that are lining projects up to build that infrastructure you're talking about, at least in that country.
Yeah. And it's going to take time. And it's interesting you mentioned the US. I mean, there are some countries that are making quite a big bet. So the EU is making a big bet on green hydrogen. You have to build up the infrastructure, like you're saying, and that's not straightforward. You have to repurpose existing assets or build new assets, because hydrogen is a very light molecule, so it can escape in traditional metallic pipelines. It can escape. So there are issues around building that infrastructure. I think the economics of hydrogen have yet to be clarified, and whether we're going green or blue. So you've got, for those uninitiated, blue hydrogen produced from reformation of gas and use carbon capture to collect the carbon dioxide. There are a number of energy players that are pushing that as a solution, because you've already got existing assets, you've got infrastructure in place. Is it the cleanest? Well, not 100%, but it may help us build momentum for a hydrogen economy. Then you've got green hydrogen produced from renewable electrolysis using renewable energy. Well, you have to make sure that you've got enough renewable energy that isn't being used for end user demands. You need a surplus of renewable energy. And with the economics of electrolysis, which historically green hydrogen has been significantly more expensive than blue hydrogen, but the costs are beginning to come down, maybe the economics work out. But it's a nascent industry. And again, it's always easier. It's good to kind of talk macro, but it's always good to bring it down to a concrete example.
Sorry, Adrian. In this landscape where you've got these decisions being made around quite significant investments to build hydrogen capability or build electrification assets or build new power generation, what do you think it means that we've got this huge ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the impacts on gas prices? How do people navigate that landscape?
Well, the Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis that we're seeing, is just another layer of complexity. Because I think, pre-crisis, you had a world very much, you think back to the end of 21 with COP26, all that momentum to decarbonize the world. The UN came out with its carbon assessment at the beginning of this year, report that said, we have to reduce greenhouse gases by 42% by 2030 if we're going to stay on that 1.5 degree scenario. And then this energy crisis has come up. And there's complications about this. One, you've got energy security top of the agenda for governments. So they're worried about making sure they have enough energy, which means some of these European states are bringing on coal-fired power generation, highly polluting, but they're having to do that to make sure they've got some kind of buffer. So that decarbonization journey is becoming more complex. And I guess the other angle as well is just the sheer cost. If you look at how much governments are spending to protect consumers and increasingly businesses from the volatility of price, we're talking hundreds of billions of euros that are being spent in the EU alone. That will need to be on top of investment in infrastructure to enable the energy transition. One stat, just to kind of bring it home, grids, in terms of transformation grids, in terms of cables under the ground, The world spends about $260 billion on grids. They're going to have to spend about 800 billion, close to a trillion by 2030, 2040 to enable the electrification of the world. That's a huge amount of spend. That's just one area. That's on top of all the spend that governments are now having to do to weather the crisis. It's getting complex.
Who spends the money on those grids? Where do you see that kind of invest coming from?
So this is all about growing grids in mature economies that are electrifying, as well as newer economies that are growing. And again, bringing it back down to earth. If you look at the UK, we've got this electrification trend with electric vehicles growing in popularity. There is likely growth of heat pumps to help decarbonize home heating, which is another big theme. And therefore, you're going to have grids reinforced in the UK to make sure they can handle that load. You've got a big growth of offshore wind farms in the UK. So you need to make sure that you've got the cables that collect the energy from the offshore wind farms up in Scotland, for example, and take it down to the areas of demand. It's that kind of investment that we're going to need.
So is that private sector? Is that going to be a tax on my EV that I buy or my fleet? Is that going to be like, somebody's paying, nothing's for free. So where's it coming from?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So great question. So to date, it's predominantly private sector investment. But again, going back to that earlier comment, and I'm going to just take it slightly in a different direction, Chris. Remember that when I talked about those partnerships in the energy transition, I think the big partnership is between government and private sector. If you look at COP26, all the previous COPs, it was all about governments setting the agenda. This last COP, it was business that was setting the agenda. And I think you need that partnership. You need the innovation and the money that the private sector can bring to enable this transformation. But you need the government to set that strategic direction and invest a little bit of seed money, particularly in some of these more nascent energy sectors like carbon capture and hydrogen, just to bring the private sector in. So I think that partnership is going to be pretty key.
So EVs help with one problem in that growth is you can control demand a little bit, I would think, if you have EVs, right? You've got storage out at the edge, so maybe you have some more flexibility in your demand. Are you seeing that as a trend as well from, let's say, utilities perspective? Are they interested in that part of this aspect?
I think that utilities, the interest of utilities, one, is they're looking pretty fundamentally at monetizing, generating new revenue streams from owning those customers that we talked about earlier. But I think the other angle that you're alluding to is you've effectively got these electric vehicles a little bit like mobile power stations. Virtual power plants, I think, is that nice expression. So if you can aggregate enough of these electric vehicles and control when they charge and when they export energy to the grid, you've got a nice way to balance the grid. There's a lot of vehicle-to-grid technology. You're seeing a lot of focus on this, but it's still very much early days.
So we're moving towards an electric system. We're moving towards electric mobility. And one of the key consumer changes that people now have to go through is charging this new electric car. Can you give us some thoughts on how that charging transition is changing and what the implications are for our existing energy system and some of the challenges we might face as we move people into this new ecosystem?
So historically, the easiest way to charge and the cheapest way to charge was at home. And you're seeing in some countries that volume of charging beginning to shift to destination charging, which I'll talk about in a minute. The problem with charging at home, as I mentioned, it's cities that are going to drive the growth of electric vehicles. I think, rural areas are important. It's quite difficult to attract investment, particularly from the private sector, given the low utilization rate. So cities are going to drive that. And therefore, home charging is important. But in cities, as we mentioned earlier, if you live in a flat or you haven't got off-street parking, it's quite difficult to charge at home. And therefore, you're then looking at on-street charging solutions. So those chargers that you can right in front of your home on the main road, or charging hubs at supermarkets or film centers, leisure centers. You're seeing more growth of those different types of charging. Now, what's interesting is all the innovation that's going around that by different companies. So again, without promoting any particular company, there's one that's got this wonderful model where they basically look at where there is free spot parking spaces, think of, for example, outside doctor surgeries or vets, where there's spaces to park, and they've developed a software where they arrange for chargers to be installed in those areas, and then they've got a software where you can book your charging space depending where you are in any major city. So nice example there. So you've got these different companies using these different styles of charging. There's another, this is more in the public domain. I can think of Tesco's with PodPoint, where they arrange to have chargers at the supermarket. You get a free slow charger, doesn't cost you anything, or you can have a fast charger, but you pay a premium price for it with advertising, for example. So again, lots of different types of business models geared to all these different ways of charging.
And of course, one of the crucial things you hear as soon as you speak to the people trying to install these chargers is, we need the grid, we need that connection. How's this whole infrastructure change going to adapt when this, local distribution networks have to handle additional loads at your doctor's surgery or outside your vet?
Yeah, so the massive, that is a huge topic, and I think you've got some very eloquent speakers coming to talk about that. So grid reinforcement is going to be a big issue in terms of making sure that different neighborhoods can manage that load. Smart charging, having chargers that you can dictate when's the best time for them to charge, is managing that load. I think that's going to be important as well. So you've got a number of these kind of demand side incentives tools. There's even in the UK, we talk about time of use tariff. You've got ways where you can incite certain behaviors amongst consumers to use their appliances, charge their cars when there's less demand on the system.
But aren't we putting the cart ahead of the horse here a little bit? I mean, I think it's really early for EVs, right? So the initial efforts, fleets, from where we're going to get the biggest return. So yeah, I can go buy an EV today, and some percentage of people are doing that. Or they're buying a hybrid maybe as an interim step along the way to get to an EV. That seems to be a pretty popular market these days because they don't want to totally pollute, but they're not ready to rely on all these charging stations and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But I guess I look at it as fleet. So I'm not sure the paradigm doesn't shift as we get there, and we don't really know the paradigm yet. Right? I think you're looking at the business models as we know the world today and the data points we have today. But when 2030 hits and internal combustion engines are not even an option there, and everybody's going to need charging, we're going to need a solution that scales. And there's not going to be enough doctor's office parking lots for me to get charged. So let's switch gears. Let's table that to further in our series, and let's talk about fleet charging, because I think that's also a change, right? And I think that's a change that we can handle today. I think that a substation can be geared, and I can find locations to get fleets and take incremental advantage in the near term. What's your perspective on that?
So we do quite a lot of work helping clients develop their fleet charging strategy, and there are lots of angles on this. So one thing is a little bit about the type of fleet that you have. So there's that discussion that we touched on earlier. Lighter vehicles, easier to electrify. The other one's a bit more challenging. So you have to figure out what those solutions will be for some of those other vehicle types. There's something around what companies want to do in terms of their fleet charging strategy. So it is not, we're going to charge them all at home. And it's not, we're going to charge them all on the depot, because you're going to have that grid issue. So what you're seeing with fleets is a hierarchy of charging. And it might be initially, the first focus is on-street charging. And then if you can't do that, maybe it's depot charging, and you might be able to leave your vehicles overnight with a trickle charge. And then you have home charging as the last option. Right? So you need to have a fleet charging strategy and a hierarchy.
So is overnight the right time if wind and solar are wind you might get at nighttime. Solar is probably a little bit more challenging at nighttime. I'm no expert in these things, but I think sunlight's probably a good part of that.
Yeah, and that's maybe when you start bringing in energy storage solutions, but clearly not perfect and not straightforward. And by the way, Chris, you've actually touched on one of the key issues, which is decarbonizing these fleets is not a straightforward issue. Go back 10, 15 years. If you're a fleet manager, you buy a nice internal combustion engine, you run it down, you recycle it, buy a new one. Now they're having to think about how do I speak to my HR department to make sure that I can get buy-in from my employees to adopt electric vehicles? How do I speak to my retail property management service so that I know where we can stick in infrastructure charging points? Yeah. How do I work with finance to make sure we can afford to procure these types of vehicles and there may be a waiting time? There's a whole bunch of new stakeholders internally that companies have to navigate in order to start that decarbonization journey. So it's complex and it's going to take a long time.
And one of my favorite points at this stage is always this idea that you're going to take this employee of this big business and you're going to say, hey, Joe, here's your new vehicle. It's electric. And you've got this huge behavioral change piece to manage as well, because no longer is it something that's known and well understood. It's now something new, and there's different behaviors that this driver has to manage. What are you seeing in that space with, the fleets and businesses having to adopt to new technologies?
It's funny, we have these conversations. We talk about business models, innovation, technology. At the end of the day, it always comes down to people. And you've hit the nail on the head there, Neil. So there's this wonderful guy who was at Centrica. He used to split the group of employees into three categories. There were those who were the equivalent of petrol heads for electric vehicles. They just love electric vehicles. The fence sitters, you're not too bothered either way. And then you have that third category, those who are wedded to their diesel vans, right? Don't worry about the second and the third group. Focus on the ambassadors. There's always a group there who will be eager advocates of transition, and you need to use them to build that momentum within an organization. The other thing is there's lots of, this is all very new, so everybody's kind of learning the tricks of the trade. But there's also things around when you're allocating electric vehicles to employees, companies are looking at where those employees live and if they've got lots of optionality to charge on street, yeah? So you're having to think about that environment, that ecosystem that enables the employees to adopt those electric vehicles.
And is it changing the business, right? So if you let's not say cars, let's say like a light delivery van. Let's say you deliver or you're doing just regional delivery type things. So I think the individual, if it's a job, will drive what you tell them if they're happy to get their paycheck, right? I mean, milk trucks were electric long before I was born, right? So that's nothing new with a delivery truck. I think that will be there, but I think the behavior, the business is in the job of being in business and making money for their shareholders. So are these electric vehicles going to impact the business and how they do business?
Big time. So one of the
answer.
Well, I'm afraid it's the truth, right? So when we interviewed a lot of these fleet managers, there was a realization that the way they operated the business was going to have to change. So I'll just give you two really simple examples. One, many of these operators of large fleets, they'll have an in-house engineering division who will service the cars, right? If they're looking to get electric vehicles, the company has to figure out whether they keep that in-house capability, whether they outsource it to the automotive OEMs who have lots of knowledge and experience in this. If you decide to keep it in-house, you have to upgrade your engineers, you have to upskill them, and you also have to figure out how you repurpose the engineering sites to accommodate these new electric vehicles. So you're changing the way you do your business. Another example is a lot of good ones, the engineers for utility companies going from A to B in their trucks, in their vans with lots of gear, equipment, etc. Because electric vans now haven't got a great range and you're having to trade off payload and range, they have to figure out a way where they leave some of the key equipment at different terminal points during the journey so that you don't exhaust the battery carrying all your gear, changing the way you operate. And maybe the last one, even, if you're going to have to charge during the day, you're going to have to work it into the rota of your employee that they take a lunch break at a certain time and recharge the vehicle. So, like I said, it's really complex and it does change the way companies behave and operate.
All right, so I think we've talked commercial a bit, and we're running short on time here in this episode. Neil, I think you were going to ask something maybe about individuals and decisions, maybe.
Yeah. So what do you see as the key decisions that individuals are having to make when they move to electric vehicles? How are they making these decisions, and what do you personally think about those decisions?
So let's look at that through the eye of the consumer, like yourself, right? You're thinking about, you want to make a difference to the world. So you're thinking about electric vehicles. And that's going to be a big driver. So the sustainability angle will be a big driver. The next one is the affordability, right? Can I afford to buy this electric vehicle? And the reality is If you buy an EV in China, you're probably paying about a 10% premium on its ICE counterpart. If you buy an EV in Europe, for example, it's a 45% premium. So you're going to have to pay more, right? Then someone will tell you, listen, Adrian, it will be more expensive, but the total cost of ownership, it'll work out cheaper. Well, yeah, and total cost of ownership in terms of insuring it, in terms of maintaining it, in terms of the fuel costs, right? That's got a bit more complicated as well, because what you've seen with the energy crisis is you're seeing power prices go up and highly volatile, and therefore that total cost of ownership is becoming somewhat diluted. So you've got initial purchase cost, you're thinking through the economics, and then the last thing that we talked about is how do I charge that vehicle? So you need to make sure that you get a charger at home, or you need to find somewhere nearby that you can charge. You've got to negotiate all these decision benchmarks. Now, this is not to say it's not going to happen. You are seeing increasing spend in EV charging infrastructure, particularly for on-street charging, EV charging hubs. So you'll see it'll be much more easy for you to charge on street or petrol retail sites that have EV chargers. You'll see the cost of electric vehicles come down as they grow in scale, as production efficiencies, as we get through the volatility of commodity costs. So those costs will come down. And underpinning all of this is that sustainability, the need to make a better world. That doesn't change. So I think we'll get there. We've just got a few rocky periods to navigate.
So my last question for me, based on what you just said, is the total cost of ownership is one thing. Is there a tipping point where I'm not going to buy an internal combustion engine just because there's no market anymore, right? So if you've mandated 2030 or some 2035 or some year that these things go away, if you look at the average ownership of a car, so if I buy a brand new car today, and I'm not someone that trades it every few years because I need a new shiny one, but I keep it for 10 years, I'm already into a point where that thing's probably worthless on the market at a certain point. So that weighs into my decision as well. How does that play into what you're saying? Because to me, I'm already thinking those things. I'm like, okay, if I need another car, even though I'm not sure that the world's totally EV ready, do I want to get stuck with a petrol car 7 years from now that I can't sell?
Yeah. You framed it really well, Chris. So I think certainly in developed economies, you've got policy that will be working against ICE vehicles, right? So you've got the ICE ban. UK's 2030. I think Norway's 2025. Others may be less aggressive, but you've got that deadline. You've got financial penalties for running diesel cars. So, in the UK, we have these ultra low emission zones, right? You'll have cities that will phase out internal combustion engines in the center. So it will just become more expensive to drive, park, and run an internal combustion engine. So I think policy is going to drive that. I think from the business side, those costs for owning the electric vehicle that we talked about will come down over time. So I think the direction of travel is clear. And the interesting thing is, you talked about how long you own a car. In the UK, I think it's roughly, Neil, about 10 years, yeah? Well, 2030 isn't that far away. So that benchmark, that deadline is coming. The other thing that needs to happen in this country and many other countries is you need a second-hand car market with electric vehicles to give people that choice. That still isn't happening here. It's still quite a small market, but that will grow. And I think when all these pieces fall into play, it will make that decision to transition to an electric vehicle easier. But I think one way or another, if you're wedded to your diesel or petrol car, I think if you're living in certain jurisdictions where there's a big focus on decarbonisation, like the EU, those days are becoming numbered.
So Adrian, you've taken us on a sprint through macro energy trends. You've taken us through climate change, battery technology, the Ukraine crisis, where hydrogen might fit, grid and its role to deliver fleets, individual buying decisions. And it leaves me really only with one question, which is, do you drive an EV and why?
So I practice what I preach. I bought a hybrid. I wanted to buy an electric vehicle. I just couldn't afford the initial cost, right? And also I live in an area where it's quite tricky to charge. So I went for a hybrid because I felt that I was doing my bit and hedging myself for the future. But a little bit like Chris was suggesting, my next car will be an electric vehicle. Now, which type of brand or model, let's see, but it will be purely electric, because I think by the time I get around to buying another one, which hopefully for the sake of my family finances will be a couple of years away, I think the direction of travel will be even clearer.
Well, I hope you enjoy that hybrid. And Adrian, I've enjoyed having you, our first guest on the EV miniseries. We're off to a strong start. Thank you for being our guest today. And for our audience, this concludes episode number 1 of our EV miniseries. Please stay tuned. We're going to have one more general episode. We're going to start going into grids. We're going to go into suppliers, OEMs, battery technology, you name it. If it's EV related, we are going to cover it, and we're going to go deep. You're going to get down to those cars you want to talk about, any element that's there. So we will talk to you again next week. And thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, follow us, and share this series with your friends. Bye-bye.